Dear Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the modern state, humanity, and barbarism. This is an entry of the Hume to Hegel series. Probably number 2. The first one is going to be describing absolute knowing versus absolute skepticism. And this piece is going to be talking about questions of Hume in comparison to Hegel, really focusing on politics, socio-political structures, justifications of the state, economics, things of this nature. And we talked about in Hegel's justification of Hegel, the element of the philosophy of right, where the state is a justification of now, its development through history. The state is not merely the state of the governmental state, but I think it's important to think about it in terms of the state of nature. And we find in Hume a similar line of thinking where the state and its political justification must be based on tradition, must be based on history, must be based on common life. It can't be, he's very, very concerned about philosophical consciousness and philosophical justifications of the state, which is, for example, like the original contract. David Hume has a really good essay on original contract where he basically suggests that, if you look at these contracts that nations are based on, like the Constitution, these different charters and different things, you really aren't going to see the entire structure of society. You just see principles, you just see notions. And a lot of these principles, now David Hume did think the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, were unique, although he was skeptical of revolutions versus reformations. That's a distinction that has to be followed. Because at least he saw in the American contract the possibility of principles of which are closer to common life, closer to people's lived and everyday experience than these grandiose justifications based on a right of kings or a quote-unquote original contract. Now, by an original contract, that's not necessarily the same as the Constitution. By that, Hume is thinking a lot more like a state of nature in a Rousseau or a Hobbes. These philosophical, hypothetical thought experiments that are supposed to prove that humanity is better off in civilization than outside of civilization, or better off outside of it, all these different things. He probably would not like John Rawls, his veil of ignorance, his theory of justice, and different things like that. Because like a book like A Theory of Justice that wants to bring together justice and fairness for Rawls, Hume would be like, that's based on ideas. He wants it to be based on common life and experience. And I think you see something extremely similar going on in The Philosophy of Right by Mr. Hegel. There's a lot of overlap there. And so philosophical reflection is very problematic. In Hegel, following the phenomenology of spirit, philosophy ultimately leads to absolute knowing, which is absolute groundlessness, the inability of philosophy to ground itself, to provide itself justification independent of its own movement, of its own notion. And so then the move from dialectical thinking to speculative reason is why? Why is the nature of reality and the nature of thought as such? And just because it's groundless does not mean it's meaningless. That's not what Hegel is getting at, but we have to better examine the nature of thoughts. Likewise, for Mr. Hume, thought eventually realizes that it must be in service of common life. Philosophy cannot be its own grounding. When he argues, for example, that is can't move to ought, that's not because morality is impossible, but because philosophical morality, as opposed to morality based on common life, is impossible. So you have to be in the suchness, as is a term I use in dialectical ethics, to determine ethics, not a thought experiment. And ultimately, David Hume makes it clear that if you follow absolute skepticism, skepticism to its logical end, you find that philosophy cannot ground itself. Therefore, philosophy is to have a function. It must be in service of lived experience in common life. Now, the paper Deconstructing Common Life is going to fill in that argument. But both Hegel and Hume we're going to see as thinkers that don't really believe philosophy can do what it quote-unquote should do, is supposed to do, unless it first accepts its ultimate groundlessness. And if philosophy is groundless, that would also mean the state is groundless, or the society is groundless, or the movement of the state is groundless. And so any state of which is trying to base itself on philosophical premises is going to be very, very problematic. And for David Hume, it will become tyrannical. And to associate Hume as such with Hegel might sound strange, because we've learned for so many years that Hegel is, who Marx follows through, and Hegel thus seems to be the great giant the great giant modern state. And certainly Hegel can be read in that tradition, but I think actually Hegel should be read more with Hume. Yes, there is a movement of rationality to put everything under the same umbrella, as the paper on Hegel's justification of Hegel will argue. But that's not the same as saying that everything becomes the same. Everything is brought together, but that might just prove, apocalyptically overwhelming because we can't handle it. So I think it's a mistake to see the growing state of nature in Hegel, the growing interconnectivity, as the same as a giant United States of America that surrounds the world, for example, or a giant empire that surrounds the world. It is to suggest that there is a growing interconnectivity, a growing state where everyone's under the same umbrella. And so I think Hume and Hegel can indeed be read together. We have to understand that much of Hume's philosophy is an attempt to show that what we call rationality in science, morals, politics, and religion is the result of a long, gradual, and largely unreflective evolution of conventions, the end of which is the coordination and satisfaction of conflicting human needs and desires. For me, that sounds a whole lot like Hegel. I think Hegel is very similar. Both are show how the development of the state is primarily an unreflective process. Now, the key is Hegel is writing after Hume, and Hegel makes the point that if philosophy has arisen in a certain moment in time, there's reason to think that philosophy is now needed for the further development of the state. But that does not mean up to that point that the process was not primarily unreflective. The process up to that point was very, very much emergent. And indeed, just because philosophy has arisen at this moment in time does not mean philosophy is supposed to be in the role of creating a grounding for the movement of the state. That seems to be what we assume. Rather, it could be that philosophy is in the business of something else, not what we tend to think it's in the business of, which, for Hume is the philosophical grounding of everything. And, for Hegel, again, at absolute knowing, we see that philosophy is ultimately groundless. So, though we see in Hegel thinking that philosophy has arisen at this moment in the state for a reason, both Hume and Hegel would agree that the role of philosophy is not what we tend to think it is, looking for some objective, non-contingent grounding. Philosophy seems to be in the business of something else. Now, for Hume, the role of philosophy has a whole lot to do with defending common life, honoring common life, determining the guidelines and principles by which to live out common life. Dall-E has mentioned in the lectures of the Science of Logic how for Hegel, philosophy is in the business of the mediating of instincts, conceptual mediation, learning to live with thoughts, learning to live with oneself, biological urges, instincts, libido, etc., so forth. And indeed, I think a understanding of philosophy having something to do with psychoanalysis, say in bringing together Lacan and Hegel, is very similar to Hume's bringing together of common life and philosophy. So both of them have this notion of philosophy as in the business of some kind of defense, some kind of mediation, as opposed to some sort of location of an objective grounding. And philosophy, for that reason, is utterly essential and necessary. For Hume, a lot of what we believe is non-rational. It is absorbed, like the paper Compelling will argue from Conflict of Mind. We absorb our non-rationality, and without that non-rationality, quote-unquote, truth, we have no way to organize our rationality. And if rationality tries to be its own foundation, it eats itself. It undergoes auto-cannibalism. That's cannibalizing yourself, where you eat yourself, like in The Committee, that very good Egyptian novel. So if rationality tries to be its own grounding, if it doesn't honor common life, it undergoes auto-cannibalism. And I think the same applies in Hegel. When philosophy doesn't reach absolute knowing, when it doesn't reach the limit of what it can know, it can be in denial of those limits, and as a result undergo absolute cannibalism, auto-cannibalism. And I think if we look in the Doctrine of Essence, when Hegel talks about A thinking, which is the law of identity, is also auto-cannibalism. It is not the case that a thing is merely itself. It's always undergoing becoming. Now, that doesn't mean A is false. It just means it's incomplete. And if we treat it as complete, we'll suffer auto-cannibalism. Ultimately, I like to argue that David Hume's philosophy follows from his politics, from his essays, that there's a through line where his political thinking is reflected in his philosophy all throughout his essays. He is extremely concerned with the growth of the modern state, with the modern state that's trying to philosophically ground itself and how that legitimizes its power in a way that can control over other people. Now, I think it's very unfortunate, I think we've read Hume basically as his politics and essays having nothing to do with his history having nothing to do with philosophy, where it's all unrelated. I don't think this is a good reading. I think there's very good reason to assume that David Hume's philosophy and his essays and so on are all in a conversation with one another. Now, I don't know of anywhere where Hume directly says my philosophy is supposed to put checks and balances and limitations on the growth of the state and is supposed to defend common life. But certainly throughout in the Inquiry of Human Understanding, where he makes it extremely clear that Lady Wisdom basically says, if you have some convoluted philosophy that doesn't honor common life, I hope you suffer the punishments of rejection, of being misunderstood. David Hume has no mercy for those who engage in abstract philosophical reasoning. Dr. Livingston talks about the spread of philosophical consciousness, which concerned David Hume. And David Hume speaks about England undergoing the new barbarism of refinement, like we see in Vico, because he thought it was becoming philosophical in nature. David Hume was very concerned and writes quite a lot on the dangers of the philosophical character of politics at his day. And it just happens to be the case that his philosophy is very, very often critiquing, quote-unquote, philosophical consciousness or philosophy separate from common life. You have the conclusion of Book 1 of the treatise. You have the understanding of human nature. And even when you get into the dialogues of natural religion, there seems to be a very important distinction between the religion of the blacksmith down the street and the religious systems of the medieval theologians. David Hume doesn't seem to have much time for religion of a philosophical character, but then religion of the average person, the religious practices of the average person, is a matter of difference. That's not the same. In the same way that he's not against politics, but he's against politics that tries to philosophically justify itself, because then it becomes auto-cannibalistic, and the state becomes auto-cannibalistic in the same way that religion becomes auto-cannibalistic. You can really see everything for Hume everything that undergoes a philosophy that tries to be its own grounding, but undergoes auto-cannibalism, basically. He has that wonderful line where he says, be a philosopher, but above all, also be a man, is the closing lines of Lady Sophia in the Inquiry. And the great Samuel Barnes in The Iconoclast is quite lovely on David Hume on this topic as well. And we see David Hume speaking of civilization and politics as undergoing a self-destruction in tyranny and auto-cannibalism as it grows. He tells us in 1752 of his plan of writing the history of the English. And you see lines throughout his essays. He also tells us in his essay, My Own Life, where he says, I was assailed by one cry of reproach, disposition, and even detestation. English, Scottish, and Irish, Whig and Tory, churchmen and secretary, freethinkers and religious, patriot and courtier, united in their rage the man. So he was well aware of what he was undergoing, and I think we can bring a little bit of a Straussian reading to Mr. Hume. He tells us that his work was rejected, that the treatise fell dead off the printing press, and also Scotland. I think David Hume was born in 1711, I believe, and I think it's around 1705 that Scotland and London come together to make Great Britain as a unity. So we see the growing state that Hume is living in the midst of, and he's writing so regularly about the issues on his essay of population side of ancient traditions and the virtues of friendship and his concerns about larger nation states hindering the possibility of friendship. So we have Hume, who is writing and thinking in the midst of a people who had been independent. And even to this day, you have movements of Scottish independence from Great Britain. And you have a man who is growing up in the midst of this new political arrangement. And you have lines throughout his essays. I think basically the big mistake, I believe is a big mistake, is reading David Hume's philosophy independent of his essays. His essays, now he covers many topics in his essays, and we also have to remember he's friends with Mr. Adam Smith, very close friends with Adam Smith, who is also writing on emergent systems before emergent is a word, the invisible hand that everyone knows about. Now I will say The Wealth of Nations is a much more tragic book than is made out to be. And we also have to remember that Mr. Smith, Dr. Adam Smith is writing on jurisprudence. He describes law as kind of developing like a garden, which is followed by Hayek later on. That Mr. Smith is not merely writing in terms of the wealth of nations. We also have his book on the sentiments, and you can certainly see Smith and Hume in discussion with one another in their work on sentiments, morality, ethics. And there's slight variance between their theories, but they're cordial. They're in discussion with one another. I mean, my goodness, Smith suffered greatly because of the obituary he wrote about David Hume, because people saw Mr. Hume as such a radical and fervent atheist that when Mr. Smith called him a good man, people went nuts. So we always have to keep that in mind. But we see throughout David Hume's essays lines such as, "Nothing appears more surprising to those who considering human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers." We see these kind of lines throughout all of David Hume. And also, funny enough, where he'll tell us to let us cherish and improve our ancient government as much as possible without encouraging a passion for such dangerous novelties. By dangerous novelties, he's talking about original contracts, philosophical theories, which basically the unification of Scotland into Great Britain requires philosophical justification. This is a key move. The larger the nation state, the more it will require philosophical justification, whereas a small state or small people can be bound by friendship, basically, by knowing one another. You don't need philosophical justification. But the larger the state, the more philosophical justification will be required, because people are going to wonder, why should I listen to the king in London? Why? I don't know him. I don't know who these people are. Why should I listen to them? Well, because there's a philosophical justification. In America, it's the Constitution, or, we believe that we are bound to the government because we live within this nation. And if you live in America and you choose not to leave, therefore, you agree to the terms. Now, I really find it in one of the original contract, Hume will tell us how kind of absurd it is in his mind that we believe that someone living in a nation means that he agrees to the contract. He writes, "Should it be said that by living under the dominion of a prince, which one might leave, every individual has given a tacit consent to his authority and promised him obedience? It may be answered that such an implied consent can only have place where a man imagines that the matter depends on his choice." Hume was notably concerned about the idea that just living somewhere meant you consented to the rules of it. He says, "Can we seriously say that a poor peasant or artisan has a free choice to leave his country when he knows no foreign language or manners, and living from day to day by the small wages which he acquires?" It is yet technically anyone can leave a nation. Practically they cannot. And yet rulers started saying, well, if you choose to live here, you give yourself over to our authority. He saw this as tyrannical. But he saw this kind of philosophical justification or philosophical claim, because this is an argument, right? This point, you live in the nation, therefore you consent to the original contract. That's not based on friendship or emotion or lived experience. That's based on a philosophical notion. And David Hume saw these kind of things as assertions of a ruling power that acted as if people had choice and they had freedom, but they did not. It was just they practically did not. And yet it then gave the rulers a license to do what they wanted. So Hume was very concerned about this. And then we see in his essay of the populousness of ancient nations, where he's speaking about Aristotle, and where Aristotle says a city with over 100,000 would fail, for a city of such size would destroy the essence of friendship, as such would occur if the city was too small. And that's important for Aristotle. If it's too small, you can't have friendship. If it's too large, you can't have friendship. And Hume replies a bit sarcastically, "What? Impossible that a city can contain 100,000 inhabitants? Had Aristotle never seen nor heard of a city so populous? This, I must own, passes my comprehension." So you see here, Hume is suggesting, what is Aristotle talking about? Does Aristotle genuinely believe a city can't have over 100,000 people? And Hume's basically saying that Aristotle is right, but doing so indirectly. Again, we have to be a bit Straussian. I think this is a more obvious sarcastic display, but we also have to see that he is speaking to Great Britain now, the unification of Scotland and England. He is speaking to the fact that we now have a nation that is certainly over 100,000 inhabitants, and the bonds of friendship and common life there must be weakened, and therefore it must be based on philosophical justice. The nation state must be justified on a philosophical basis, and that means it is susceptible to a dangerous auto-cannibalism. Now, of course, in Hegel, we learn that we have to put ourselves in the place of autocannibalism and not be consumed. So we're not saying we should avoid this is the development of the philosophical notion where you have to come to accept groundlessness and learn to live with it. But for David Hume, the problem is a nation state. To basically, you see, the problem is that it's putting itself in the place of autocannibalism without believing it's in the place of autocannibalism, believing that it is genuinely philosophically justified, and this is going to lead to all sorts of trouble for Mr. Hume. Now, again, in that essay on the populace, it's very interesting on the populousness of ancient nations, because Hume, he suggests that a lot of people viewed ancient civilizations, Greece, Rome, etc., as very large nation states, very huge, and that therefore you say, oh, those empires in the past were so great because they were large. Oh, that must have been why they were great. And so Hume goes back. So you have this kind of interpretation of the past as legitimizing the large nation state. And David Hume, one, goes, I don't buy the evidence. I don't think it's very large. I don't think those previous nation states were large. And therefore, if they were great civilizations, it should be the small nation state that we come to support. So we see here Hume kind of saying, it's funny how we admire, he has this line where he says, the humor of blaming the present and admiring the past is strongly rooted in human nature. But then, of course, the past that we admire isn't even real. So that's another example of imagining the past in a certain way that legitimizes present efforts that actually are very problematic because that interpretation of the past never existed. And so Hume is combating this interpretation of the past legitimizing large nation states to point out that small nation states are better. And again, his entire philosophy suggests that a way to sum up, say, his critique of is to ought, or verification, or the stable self, impressions, all these different things, sentiment versus moral theory, all of these is basically arguing that if it can be extracted, it's false. If you can extract the idea from the phenomenon, it's false and in fact tyrannical, and it is a threat. And he is extremely concerned about nation states growing to a size where they are extracted and unrelated to the realms in which they are governing, and they justify that power with a philosophical notion. He believes this will lead to tyranny. And again, it just happens to quote-unquote be the case that his philosophy would all check and balance this tyrannical movement. Again, maybe it is unrelated. There is I cannot say I have hard evidence that David Hume's philosophical project is directly correlated or linked with his political and historical studies and works and essays, but it would be very strange to me if they are not related because they fit together so well. And again, we always have to remember and Livingston will talk about this, and is the great anti-Scottish sentiment. There's a lot of discrimination against the Scottish with the English. And David Hume is also well aware of the fate that befalls philosophers who oppose the government and power. I believe David Hume, it is said that David Hume lived a more merry and quiet life later on, so I'm not trying to say that David Hume suffered oppression, but he was also a bit tactful, perhaps, a little wise in knowing what to write and what not to write, and how to write it, and how to get forth his point without alerting people to his arguments. And again, perhaps the politics and philosophy of David Hume do not relate, but I would find that as unlikely as saying that the history, politics, and philosophy of Hegel do not relate. They all go together. They're inseparable, and I think the same applies for Hume. The problem is because we tend to interpret Hume as a mere empiricist or a mere skeptic, then once you read his philosophy through that lens, it seems like it has nothing to do with his essays, because under that lens, it has nothing to do with his essays. So then he just becomes a kind of assortment of insights into different areas with no through line, with no notion that's connecting them all. So the misinterpretation of Hume as a mere skeptic and empiricist therefore fragments all of his philosophy into shards that can't go together. And I think this is very, very problematic. And in this way, we can see in Hume, in the same way that Hegel tells us in the Elements of the Philosophy of Right, that, the owl of Minerva flies, the philosopher is not supposed to think of the future, they're supposed to think of the now. Likewise, you can see in Hume a insistence that the philosopher is to think the common life, is to think the now, not the future. And certainly, again, for Hume, there's a danger in thinking the past, because look, we just interpret the past in manner to support our current notion. It is very interesting that Hume thinks of himself as a historian in one instance and a philosopher in another, as if he's trying to keep those things apart. And yet still informing one another. And I think you see a similar dance, a similar balance going on in Hegel. And so both of them are unified in a philosophy being bound to the now. And as Mr. Livingston says about both of these thinkers, they both are individuals for whom philosophy is the main problem of philosophy. And both of them are aware of the tendency of philosophy to go outside its proper bounds and to thus flirt and risk auto-cannibalism. And both are aware of a kind of philosophical reflection which subverts one's humanity, which must be avoided at all cost. And for Mr. Hume, the larger the nation state becomes, the more prone it is to subvert humanity. For Hegel, the more philosophy tries to plan the future or think of the future or take over political power in service of its own notion, then the more likely that humanity will be subverted and destroyed. For both, the good and the true must first be real, for otherwise the superstition internal to the philosophical act might be missed. In the paper on conspiracies and Pandora's rationality, it is argued that the nature of rationality is conspiratorial, to create internally consistent systems. Even though it's necessary, it has that possibility of throwing us into a Pitchin novel. The conflict of mind will also describe this as the Pitchin risk. And both of them, for both Hume and Hegel, this problem arises if philosophy does not accept the limit of absolute knowing, its impossibility of grounding itself, and then coming to accept that and integrate with that quote-unquote lack, to use Lacan's term. If that is missed, philosophy becomes extremely destructive. And the problem is that the philosophically justified state, the modern state, if you want to use that term, uses philosophy without acknowledging its absolute groundlessness, without acknowledging absolute knowing, thus making it notably susceptible to totalitarianism, and this really concerns Hume. What we see in Hume is an understanding that both ancient and modern philosophers have been guilty of optimistic and exaggerated claim to the power of human reason. And this is notably absurd when you ask questions of can you know what rain itself feels like from only the idea of rain? Of course not. Can you know what a hamburger tastes like from the idea of a hamburger? Of course not. Hume has the line in the Inquiry where he says of human understanding, where the most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. The dullest sensation is far more vivid than a thought. And yet, we tend to experience thoughts as being more vivid than phenomena, as being more powerful, making us susceptible to falling into this philosophical consciousness that's so dangerous. There is something about reason that presents itself as superior to things. And yet, looking at this book cabinet is always more vivid and more clear than the idea of the book cabinet. So it's clear in experience that experience is more real than ideas. And it thus makes sense that ideas should be in service of common life and actuality than the other way around. But there's something about how we phenomenologically experience ideas that makes us prone to believe ideas are more powerful and more real, quote unquote, than things. It's probably because the essay will talk about how if I'm watching a cat, I can't, it's going to walk across the room. It's going to, the porch, it's going to change through time. The cat's going to change. But I can imagine a cat sitting on the porch and never moving forever. An idea can be non-contingent. I can freeze an idea. And what you see there is ideas are so powerful. Ideas don't ever have to be disrupted, right? And perhaps part of it is that ideas present themselves as so perfect, as so unchanging, as so unmoved. And thus it is easy to believe that ideas are more powerful than things because things change, they get old, they die, they rust, they go away, but ideas last forever. So it seems like ideas are more powerful than things. And yet in experience, just tapping the desk here, it's clear that the feeling is more real than the thought of the feeling of the thud of my fingers hitting the wood. So David Hume's like, pay attention to that. I think this also gets, as Cadell has mentioned, the need to negate and sublate Plato into Hegel, because there is something about the forms that is true. But there's also, we have to understand what perfect is according to the form. Are we talking Aquinas' notion that a thumb is perfect if it works? Or are we talking without blemish? These are questions that have to be described. But for David Hume, the sensations are clearly more vivid and real than thoughts. And so we have to overcome this natural tendency of thought and rationality to present itself as omnipotent, as all-powerful. Because if we don't, then it will seem legitimate that the state should ground itself in rationality, that it should seek philosophical justification. After all, that's where the power lies, right? And so then we fall into the auto-cannibalism of philosophical consciousness without realizing it. To close, what's so interesting with all of this is when David Hume's looking over at the English, he believes that there's a new barbarism that's emerging. It's like the barbaricism of reflection, refinement with Foucault. And it's this way of making the whole world meet in intellectual and abstract concept that destroys everything. It won't find a home anywhere because nowhere meets its standard. The barbarian roams the countryside. They have no home. And by all of common life having to meet a philosophical standard, then it's a new barbarism that tears everything up. And Hume believes that this is defining the political project of his day. And again, we see through all of his essays a concern about this new barbarism. That there is a question of the degree that Foucault influenced Hume. I would be surprised if there was not influence. They're certainly on the same wavelength, with Foucault being the father of the counter-enlightenment that Hume in the Scottish Enlightenment is part of, and other thinkers up through what I like to call the beginning of the modern counter-enlightenment in Hegel. So you have this new barbarism that Hume is so concerned about. And ultimately, too, philosophy allows the possibility of totalization, and the modern state seeks totalization. And Dr. Livingston is concerned, and Hume suggests this as well, that the possibility of a new totalizing warfare and a new totalizing conflict is going to be possible. And unfortunately, this would mean that there might be a correlation between the spread of philosophical consciousness and world warfare. And this is something Dr. Livingston brings up. And this is not to say that World War I or World War II was just a result of philosophy or bad philosophy or false philosophy, to use Hume's language. Of course, you had to have the Industrial Revolution, interconnectivity, inventions, certain black swans, and so on. But it is hard to imagine totalizing warfare without totalizing ideas and the ability to totalize. And so then what ends up happening is you get this language of totality that philosophy makes possible, because notions like freedom for all, that's not bound to a geographical land. The freedom for all is global. And so there's an obligation to spread freedom to the world, and anyone who stops it must be stopped. And so you get a global war. And Dr. Livingston writes, World War I began as the usual limited European war to be won quickly and settled quickly. It was greeted with almost sporting enthusiasm on both sides. But after the first year, a stalemate was reached, and causalities had risen beyond what anyone could have imagined. Rather than reach a negotiated settlement, it was thought that there had to be an ultimate meaning to such losses. America entered the war. Social progressives now spiritualized war into a holy crusade to restructure all of Europe, to abolish aristocracy, and to establish universal democracy. The war was transformed by the language of totality. It was now the war to make the world safe for democracy and the war to end all wars. The concept of the final war, the philosophically reflexive war, is perhaps the ultimate in the barbaricism of refinement. And we also, of course, have Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, warning that the world wars are led to by the Enlightenment project, of which Hume and the counter-Enlightenment is all critiquing. Rather one accepts this argument or not, it is of note. And again, if there's something about philosophy, the bad philosophy, that causes World War I, there's probably no World War II without World War I. Might not be a Cold War, Korea, arguably the entire 20th century is made in the shadow of World War I. And if World War I is started by a philosophical consciousness that gets out of hand, people kind of stumble into it. There's that book, The Guns of August, I believe, it won the Pulitzer, about, so much of how the European nations fell into World War I, and they're like, how did we end up here? They almost stumbled into it. It's like, what happened? How did this occur? It makes me think of The Angel of History. Benjamin describes from Clee being pulled through, forced forward as there's this growing pile of debris, and it's wondering, it can't stop itself. It just looks on in horror. What Dr. Livingston is suggesting, and I think Hume suggests as well, is that the philosophical consciousness is what makes possible this totalizing war, and that's quite problematic. Now, again, so many people have blamed Hegel as being part of the totalization that leads to total war in different things. But what's fascinating to note is that Hegel far more aligns, in my view, with the counter-enlightenment than the Enlightenment project, which again still amazes me to this day, and I'm in Cadell's debt for the realization that the reading of Hegel through Marx indeed feeds the Enlightenment project that leads into totalization and total war. But the reading of Hegel alongside Hume could actually work against the language of totalization that can lead to the philosophical consciousness, the barbaricism of reflection and refinement that is leading to all sorts of trouble in the world, even to this very day, suggesting that we need to rethink and reconsider what philosophy exactly is, so that we might avoid its auto-cannibalism in favor of the negation sublation that both Hume and Hegel, through dialectical logic, suggest is possible for us right now. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, and so on. And thank you so much for your time.